On behalf of the New School and the Vera List Center, I'd like to welcome you to Birth and Rebirth of a Nation. This is the second part of a day-long examination on the Civil War and its legacy in conceptions and understandings of race in this country. D.W. Griffiths' horrific white supremacist film, The Birth of a Nation, which was screened this morning, provides us with the impetus to ask some of the following questions. How do we think critically and constructively about the illusionary idea of a post-racial America as we look back at film history? The enduring legacy of slavery and racism has recently reasserted itself through the arrest of Henry Louis Gates. By presenting The Birth of a Nation, are we uncovering remnants of virulently vibrant strands of racism in America, or are we needlessly reopening closed chapters in American history? How does The Birth of a Nation legitimize fear as a condition that allows for inhuman acts? Such processes and mechanisms of legitimization have informed both the making of the film and its reception. Are any parallels to be drawn to conditions today when fear legitimizes criminal actions? And then what are the appropriate responses to this legacy? How do contemporary filmmakers respond to this history? And are there ways to make it productive? Bill Gaskins is an artist, lecturer, and a professor at Parsons, the New School for Design, who conceived of this program and brought it to the Vera List Center. It gives me great pleasure to introduce him now. As teacher, he has the passion, the patience, and the psychological insight to listen and respond to his students or audiences effectively. And as an artist with a rich body of work that addresses the relation between race and photographic representation, Bill synthesizes and articulates in aesthetic form the insights and discoveries of scholars such as the ones he will introduce us to in the course of this afternoon. I am most grateful to him and to the panelists for joining us later. After Bill's introduction and the individual presentations, the panelists will convene here on stage for a roundtable discussion at about 4 o'clock. Just before then, our students will collect the cards that you've been handed with any questions that you would care to have answered by the panelists. The roundtable will be moderated by Margot Jefferson, who is also a faculty member at the New School at the college, the Eugene Lang College for Liberal Arts. Little break after that, and at 5:30 we will screen DJ Spooky's Rebirth of a Nation, and he will, we hope, land in time from arriving from Ireland to join us for an informal conversation afterwards at 7 o'clock. Please note that the event is being recorded. By being here, you agree that we may use your likeness and your voice in recordings of this event as we see fit. Students of New School Radio are also here and may take it upon themselves to ask you specific questions in between the presentations. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, panelists.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, everyone, for choosing to be here on a beautiful Saturday afternoon. I'm here to talk about how we got here, historically, institutionally, and personally, prior to talking about our speakers. We love myths in America. Santa Claus, the Tooth Fairy, Big Man. We love to deal with things that are ideals. And oftentimes the line between an ideal and a myth in America can be awfully, awfully blurry. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Birth of a Nation opens by depicting two competing myths: the myth of white supremacy and the myth of the Negro problem. If you leave here today with anything, leave here with this: There was no Negro problem in 1915 when this film was made. And there is no race problem today. There is a Negro and racialized presence that exposes white supremacy as a myth. The slavery of the 19th and the 20th century was not a myth. Neither are the customs, laws, policy, structural beliefs, and barriers to the descendants of slaves in America and their life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They're not myths either. Those barriers are not myths. And the burden of disproving these myths remain disproportionately the burden of the descendants of those slaves in this country. Quote, "Slavery is receiving by irresistible power the work of another man and not by his consent." End of quote by Baptist minister Garrison Frazier. He said this in 1865. The Birth of a Nation glorifies these myths in spectacular fashion. So why show this film? As I have been asked since we programmed this publicly. Too few Americans have seen this film beyond colleges and universities and beyond film festivals that attract cinephiles. American higher education has been the incubator for many of the myths that the film depicts. And as we are in one of the leading colleges and universities in this country, we want to dismantle some of these myths in its name. Now, David Blight has written and lectured about slavery, the Civil War, and national memory. I want this program to address the issue of amnesia, the national amnesia around memory. And several years ago, at a panel at Princeton University, Michael Eric Dyson gave perhaps the best definition of what this national amnesia is around slavery. And he divided it into 3 types of amnesia. First is resistant amnesia. It wasn't that bad. The second is revisionist amnesia. It didn't happen that way. The third is repentant amnesia. It's just too hard to talk about. Now, I add a fourth, and I think it's a form of amnesia that most people in this room have been an audience to or familiar with. And I call it reductive amnesia. It's when slavery and its complexity is reduced to simple parts as opposed to its complex whole. My favorite is slaves sold slaves. Africans sold Africans. Yes, that's a part of a very, very complex whole, but it's an amnesia that allows most people to reduce this very complex fact to something all too simple and allow the cycle of shock, denial, dismissal, and stasis that Ruth Frankenberg talks about in her book, The Politics of Whiteness. Now, abuses of the First Amendment right to free speech since the campaign, election, and inauguration of Barack Hussein Obama have been nothing less than a cinema of terrorism. And a cinema of terrorism that's not unlike the birth of a nation. Now, this month marks my 10th year teaching at Parsons/New School. And my experience with students here is that there is a serious hunger for an engagement with race that enables them to have a vocabulary for dealing with it and negotiating it beyond an event like this. Consider this following quote. My experience with issues of race being foregrounded in coursework at Parsons has usually been disappointing at best. There have been a few exceptions, but those exceptions have not been given the due weight and merit in the larger Parsons community that I think they deserve. That was Ida Benedetto, Parsons Lang class of 2009. The next quote, when I sat down and started trying to synthesize my thoughts about race, I realized how unprepared I felt to have this discussion because it hasn't been one that has existed for me during my 4 years here. And I really shouldn't be leaving here feeling unprepared. That was some Sarah Gagnon Lang class of 2009. So this event is an extension of my classroom, and it animates much of what I do in the body, mind, and souls of the people who will be speaking here today. And it's dedicated to my students, both past and present. So, with that said, the scholars here today have been assembled for their ability to describe, define the symbols and signs that are within the film Birth of a Nation. But they're also here because of their ability to describe and define the signs and symbol in the social, cultural, political, and economic world beyond Birth of a Nation, beyond the New School. So, with that said, I'd like to bring to the stage Professor David Blaine.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Karen, for organizing this symposium and for showing Birth of a Nation. That's always a tough choice to make. To me, it's always been the most interesting thing about Birth of a Nation is always talking to those who've seen it for the first time. And we were off in a little room having lunch, and the young man from, there you are. Sorry, I don't remember your name. That's right, Santiago, from the New School radio station. Had just seen it for the first time. So I quizzed him. And, you know, it's a similar response that I've seen among many other students over the years. He wasn't sure how to react, to laugh, to cry. He said, wow. And then he said, did people really believe any of that? You know. Well, as a historian for my 15 minutes or so up here, my job, in a sense, is to try to offer some explanation of why the answer to that is yes. Yes, indeed. The Englishman John Ruskin, writer, visited the United States during and after the Civil War, and he became stunned, really, about the way Americans started to write about their Civil War, to talk about their Civil War. He said, they wrote about their Armageddon as though, I quote him, they were washing their hands in blood and whistling. Now, he meant a lot, probably, by that passage, but there's a little bit in that passage that says something about Birth of a Nation as well. Washing our hands in blood and then just whistling. Du Bois famously in Black Reconstruction, one of those books, one of the early efforts, he wasn't absolutely first, but he's pretty close. One of the very first attempts to dislodge and to critique and to revise and overthrow the traditional history, traditional version of Reconstruction that Birth of a Nation so represents. In Black Reconstruction in 1935, Du Bois famously called the field of Reconstruction, or the understanding of Reconstruction in America, he called it, quote, a field devastated by passion and belief. And he said the nation had, about this subject of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction, had suffered what he called a searing of its memory. A searing, a burning, a ripping out of its memory, a disintegration, maybe. I mean, that word sear, that verb searing can mean a lot of things. He said the nation's history had been, his words, misshapen by white supremacy. Indeed. Gunnar Myrdal, one could go on with these passages, in his famous 1940 The American Dilemma, his famous, huge sociological study of the problem of race in the United States. Myrdal, the Swedish sociologist, among the many, many things he said in that classic work, he said, the myth of the horrors of Reconstruction, which is what the film's all about, the myth of the horrors of Reconstruction, he called, quote, a set of false beliefs with a purpose. A set of false beliefs with a purpose. Propaganda with a purpose. History with a purpose. History why they believe, one needs to remember in 1915. Now, I want to say just a little bit of background. It's impossible in 15 minutes to convey how deeply this so-called tragic legend of Reconstruction had sunk into American culture and had come to envelop the American imagination. It might be helpful for me to lay out the three kinds of memory of the Civil War. Bill, I liked your remembrance of Michael Eric Dyson's three kinds of amnesia, and I like your fourth, the reductionist kind, too. I got to think more on that. But in this book I did on Civil War memory a few years back, I divided the way Americans came to, now in popular memory, the way Americans came to remember or to process and understand the Civil War and Reconstruction. The first kind of memory I called reconciliationist memory. Now this, as the term implies, took root early. It took root in the midst of the war and dealing with the unprecedented sense of loss, the unprecedented sense of the dead, and dealing with the dead. And it developed over time, of course, out of the deep necessity of somehow putting the American Union back together. A reconciliationist form of memory. That's all over Birth of a Nation, too. The second kind I called emancipationist memory. It's a bit of an awkward term on your tongue, but I could never come up with a better word. It's embodied in the way the war came to destroy slavery. It's embodied in the launch of black freedom. It's embodied in the political and civil rights born of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments during Reconstruction for African Americans. It's embodied, this emancipationist memory was embodied in radical Reconstruction, led by Thaddeus Stevens Stoneman in this film, and others. And that emancipationist vision or memory of the Civil War, of course, though it loses the debate in America, it loses the popular struggle over controlling that memory in the half century after the war, and frankly, in the full century after the war. It is the surviving elements of that emancipationist vision, I've argued, others have, that actually made the modern civil rights movement even possible. And the third kind of memory, and this is where Birth of a Nation was so important, still is, I called white supremacist memory. That's exactly what it was and is. This was the memory rooted in the idea that the races, white and black, could never be equal, that emancipation may have been, indeed, possibly inevitable because of the war, but a terrible shame. Even perhaps the worst thing that had happened in 19th century America. Emancipation seen in this view as something that happened way too fast, before history was ready for it, before black people were ready for it. And eventually the white supremacist modes or forms of the memory of the Civil War and Reconstruction locked arms with reconciliationist memories of all kinds and delivered the country an essentially racially segregated memory of this epic event easily by 1900, and certainly by the time of the 50th anniversary of those events in 1915, when Birth of a Nation was put out. Think of this another way. In America, in the wake of our Civil War, 620,000 dead, 1.2 million wounded, a level of loss and suffering unlike Americans would ever experience again. If you took the rate per capita of death and loss in the American Civil War and moved it to the Vietnam era per capita, Americans would have lost 5 million people in Vietnam. That's the scale of loss. Well, how a society reconciles, processes that degree of loss is, of course, has everything to do with whatever form of national or social identity it can form. But what Americans faced in the wake of the Civil War were two harrowing, compelling challenges, and that these two never developed in balance, or couldn't develop in balance, is why we got Birth of a Nation. The first compelling challenge was healing. The country had to find some way to heal. The South couldn't be cut off and made a new continent and sent somewhere else. Most ex-Confederates were still going to be here. Somehow, it was a society that had to heal. But at the same time, it had just undergone a revolution, a social revolution, a political revolution, a constitutional revolution, a military revolution, a war of conquest. And the second great challenge, of course, was justice. Justice in a new order, justice in a redefined American republic, justice in the second American republic, because the first one had been destroyed. Another way we don't always like to look at American history. We like to see American history as continuities. We destroyed the first republic in the Civil War. We had to reinvent a second one. We may even be living in the third now, or the fourth, depending on how you want to count these things. But healing and justice had to develop in balance. if the Klan, Jim Crow, Birth of a Nation celebration of all of that could have been prevented. But it wasn't. At an 1877, there are 100 or 1,000 examples of this, I'll just give one. At an 1877 annual meeting, this is right at the sort of chronological end of Reconstruction, as we call it, of the Southern Historical Society, the keynote speaker was John T. Morgan, a Confederate veteran, and he portrayed the Reconstruction era, which he defined as 1868 to 1877, as what he called the 9 Years' War of Reconstruction, and the era as what he called, quote, the dishonorable oppression for an unworthy cause. That oppression, of course, was by the North against the South, by the Union against former Confederates. Reconstruction, Morgan maintained, had been what he called the Second War, the first being the Civil War. I quote him, "If we have now met in peace and reconciliation, the we here meaning the blue and the gray, ex-Yankees, ex-Confederates, if we have now met in peace and reconciliation upon the broad concessions mutually accepted that the war was not a crime, we need not therefore inquire who was ever right or who was ever wrong." I want to suggest here, and again, I can only just say it and suggest it without 10 examples, which is what historians tend to do, and I won't. But if you can get your head around this idea that slowly but surely, not everybody believes this by 1877, but by the 1880s and the 1890s and the turn of the 20th century, and by the time millions are watching Birth of a Nation, they are living in a society that has taught itself for 2 going on 3 generations that in that Civil War, that ghastly bloodletting of the Civil War, everybody was right. Nobody was really wrong. And there was plenty of glory to go around. The war was a great and good thing. Terrible, but a great and good thing, because out of it was invented and created a great nation. It's that period after the war that was such a sordid and dastardly mistake. And that second war had to be won as well, as Morgan called it. Now, what we call the lost cause myth, or lost cause, I call it a lost cause ideology, and it was. The lost cause was really a racial ideology, among other things. That version of the Civil War that took hold in the American South in the 1860s and 70s and developed into a full-blown popular culture and historical industry by the 1880s, 90s, turn of the century. This idea that the South had never fought for slavery, had only fought for constitutional principles, for constitutional liberty, for states' rights. They had only fought for home. And the idea that they were only, in the end, not really defeated on the battlefield, but overwhelmed, as Lee said in his farewell address, by superior numbers and resources. A noble fight for great principles. The lost cause ideology actually became, by the 1890s, and easily by the time Dixon and Griffiths finally make their collaboration out of Dixon's novels, the lost cause had become a victory narrative. It wasn't about loss at all. It was about victory over Reconstruction. Birth of a Nation is a victory narrative. God knows. I mean, how many times you have to watch the Klan riding through the countryside to victory? Enough already. We got it. The Klan's going to win. I went to the men's room, came back, Klan was still winning. I went out and made a cell phone call, came back, Klan was still winning. I just, I gave up. Now, a quick word or two about how and why this so-called tragic legend of Reconstruction sunk so deep into our culture. What is that story? Now, some of you know this. It's essentially, well, you've seen it in Birth of a Nation, but let me put it in some words. It's essentially this story. Again, in the war, there was glory enough to go around. It was fought by noble Yankees dying to save the nation and to make men free. And it was fought by noble Confederates fighting for constitutional principles and for their homes. Their memory of the soldiers, that mutuality of soldiers' sacrifice, became a kind of balm to heal a nation's wounds. And the country it took a while to do these blue-gray reunions, but by the 1880s and especially the 1890s, blue-gray reunions were the biggest thing happening in the United States. Cities would compete to have them because you get these thousands and thousands of veterans coming with their families and spending lots and lots of money. But Reconstruction, however, it's captured often in the book titles. The earliest books written about Reconstruction, The Dreadful Decade, The Age of Hate, Claude Bowers' famous, huge bestseller book that's later in the 1920s, The Tragic Era. It gets called the nadir of national disgrace, and on and on and on. The prostate state, and so on and so on. Reconstruction was portrayed in its earliest histories, in its very wake, and even during Reconstruction, and even by Northerners, not just Southerners, as a time of sordid corruption, of an occupation of the South, a military occupation, an exploitation of a defeated people, and and this is especially key, a radical effort to revolutionize the racial order. Black suffrage in particular was that weapon, that wedge, by which that Republican Party, where the radicals inside of it had taken over in the wake of the noble and benighted and moderate Lincoln, and had driven the right to vote for black people down the throats of the country while Southern states were still out of the Union and disfranchised. It became a perfect kind of Victorian melodrama. And of course, melodrama has its necessities, and you saw it in the film. You got to have villains and you got to have heroes. You got the innocence of Southern whites. You've got the greedy, evil Northern radicals and carpetbaggers. The Republicans are branded everywhere as repressive, as uncivilized, as, quote, vulturous adventurers, and on and on. Some historians serious historians, came eventually, late 19th, early 20th century, to call the Reconstruction period, always beware when historians start using terms like this, they called it an abnormal period. That, of course, assumes that somehow everything around it was normal, but there's an abnormal period. Well, abnormal to what? Whenever one says, well, that's an odd, abnormal, weird period of history, there seems to be an assumption that there's something before that had a kind of normal grandeur that the abnormal period is now destroying. Then there was this school of interpretation. You've heard it. We all use, at least in the field, we all use this term, the Dunningite school, or the Dunning school of interpretation. Well, that can be boiled down to basically this. It was William Dunning, who taught for years and years at Columbia here in New York. This wasn't invented at the University of Alabama or, South Carolina, up the street. Dunning and a generation of students he trained who wrote monograph after monograph after monograph from about 1900, way into the 1920s, even the 30s. And eventually they wrote state-by-state studies of the South, all basically driven by the same set of assumptions, the same kind of research. Dunning was a good researcher. He had some blinders. There are basically these parts to the Dunning School. First, Lincoln has to be there at the beginning of the story. The noble, compassionate, healing, malice toward none, charity for all Lincoln. Wiped out, of course, 1865. If only Lincoln had lived is a certain assumption that drives this historiography. Lincoln's lenient plan toward the South, his compassion toward the South, which he was to a degree, was now to be destroyed by the vindictive radicals who would take over the Republican Party and sink the South into humiliation. The second chapter, so to speak, of the Dunning School is their arguments over and over that Andrew Johnson, who follows Lincoln, of course, the Tennessean, restored the ex-Confederate states to the Union very quickly. He had them all back ready to come into the Union by December 1865. They come to Washington with their delegations, some of them actually still wearing their Confederate uniforms, which for some Northern Republicans was a bit more than they could take. But nevertheless, Johnson was ready to restore the Union as fast as possible, get the terrible memories of this war behind us, get it done. But of course, he can't, because the vindictive, sinister radicals wrest control of the Reconstruction process from Andrew Johnson. They set up the Reconstruction Committee in 1866. They get a veto-proof majority of both houses of Congress in the fall elections of 1866. They ram through the great 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause, and eventually the 15th Amendment. They passed the first Civil Rights Act. They passed the 4 Reconstruction Acts, and they put the South under military occupation for a little while. And one of the deepest, deepest myths you cannot kill in this society is that that military occupation was somehow thousands upon thousands of troops. It wasn't. By 1870 and into the 70s, virtually all the federal troops anywhere in the South were garrisoned in coastal forts. They weren't in towns. They weren't bothering anybody, and most of them were not black. But all of this was done, of course, on the engine of black suffrage. And in the Dunning School, sometimes it's subtle and sometimes it's blunt, like a knife. Black suffrage becomes the great mistake of Reconstruction. Giving black folk the vote was just a terrible mistake. And then comes the third chapter, and in chronological order, it's correct. What we've all come to call, and what the South called, Southern redemption. The redeemers were the Southern Democrats, who wrested back control of their state governments early by 1870 in some states, other states by 73, 74, and the 3 remaining unredeemed Southern states, that is, not taken back by the Democrats, are redeemed by 1876 and 1877, such that by that year, by the disputed election of 1876, all the ex-Confederate states are back under the control of the Southern white supremacist, make no mistake, virulently white supremacist Democratic Party. And the right to vote, hold office, live civic, political lives, live lives of any security is beginning to be snuffed out for African Americans. And much, not all, but much of the success of that Southern redemption, of course, and we have massive scholarship on this now, was done by the Ku Klux Klan as an arm of the Southern Democratic Party, as well as its many, many imitators. This Southern redemption and the creation of Southern Home Rule becomes a triumph in the Dunning School historiography and a national triumph. It becomes the nation's victory over Reconstruction. Now, I say that because Griffith and Dixon, yes, Dixon was close friends with Woodrow Wilson. They had been in the same seminar at Johns Hopkins together. You can't just blame all of Dixon on Woodrow Wilson, however, even though Griffith quotes Wilson in the film and appropriates him and says, well, he's president of the United States then. It's like everybody quotes Obama now, even if Obama never said anything about the subject. But what Dixon and Griffith are drawing upon, this is the essential point, and it's what I was trying to convey to Santiago over lunch so quickly, is that this has now become the Dunningite School, the tragic legend of Reconstruction, whatever label we want to give it, it has become the mainstream, general, normative understanding of Reconstruction in American society. If you went to school in the United States by 1915, that's the version of Reconstruction you learned, even if you were black, by and large. So, it's a film that captures, but I have to confess, I still have a hard time getting my head around the idea that Griffith, and everything I've read on Birth of a Nation, I was trying to get this confirmed by my colleagues in film history in particular, he apparently was shocked and confused by the reactions, by the protests from NAACP and other organizations around the country to this film. He apparently just didn't get it, that would bother people. Now, I don't know enough about Griffith. I know a fair amount about him. He's a Southern-born boy, learned his Civil War history at the knee of his father and grandfather. Father was a Confederate veteran, and on and on and on and on and on. He had these legends in his blood, but he just didn't get it. But I thought I'd end with just by quoting actually Dunning, a very serious scholar. William Dunning was not a slipshod scholar. He did a lot of research. He wrote a piece called, there's a whole book actually, called The Undoing of Reconstruction. It's his history of the redemption movement, of the third part of this story, about 1910. And it's a long tale about how Southern redemption came about. It's a very sympathetic treatment of Southern redemption. And he's trying to link it now to the creation of the Jim Crow system. And he refers to the various laws that have been passed since Mississippi does it first in 1890, and then North Carolina later. And by 1910, virtually every Southern, every ex-Confederate state had disfranchised blacks from voting utterly by 1910, almost utterly. And he celebrates that. And this is the way he ends his analysis of Southern redemption. I'll just quote the last several lines. "This was," said Dunning, "that the ultimate root of the trouble in the South had been not the institution of slavery, but the coexistence in one society of two races so distinct in characteristics as to render coalescence impossible. That slavery had been a modus vivendi through which social life was possible." Here you get slavery as a normative thing. It had controlled African peoples. It had controlled race relations. It had controlled labor. It had built wealth for generations. But suddenly that was broken so fast by war. And he goes on. That slavery had been the modus vivendi through which social life was possible, and that after its disappearance, its place must be taken by some set of conditions which, if more humane and beneficent in accidents, must in essence express the same fact of racial inequality. The progress, I'm still quoting Dunning, the progress in the acceptance of this idea, meaning Jim Crow, in the North has measured the progress in the South of the undoing of Reconstruction. It's a national triumph. And he ends, "In view of the questions which have been raised by our lately established relations with other races," meaning abroad, the Philippine War, etc., "it seems most improbable that the historian will soon or ever have to record a reversal of the conditions which this process has established." That's Dunning saying Jim Crow, as a replacement for slavery, is so natural, so normative, so obvious, we don't even need to debate it anymore. If we can try to understand that Griffith's mind is right there with Dunning, maybe we can understand why he wasn't shocked. Maybe. Thank you.
Michele Wallace, ladies and gentlemen.
From the first time I saw this film in its entirety, to me, one of the most striking things about the film was its score. But nonetheless, seeing it is kind of like an overwhelming experience, and I was overwhelmed by it for years. But what happened then was, aside from all the various research that I did on the topic, when I wrote my dissertation on images of race and gender in the period from 1898 through 1927, one of the things, of course, I focused on was Birth of a Nation. When I went to do this PhD on film, I had hoped to find a great many neglected films and various extenuating circumstances that would show me, make it easy for me to find out what was really going on culturally with African American images and images of race, and maybe even images of racism, something that would present itself as the reality as opposed to the picture that Birth of a Nation was giving. I had hoped by studying the period in film and representation that I would not be confirmed in the impression that I had when I came to the study of these images, that Birth of the Nation was actually the strongest, most resonant occasion of filmic representation in the period. Unfortunately, it turned out to be that the impression that Birth of a Nation was the most important thing that happened in film is not entirely mistaken. I mean, it's hard to know because so many films have been destroyed. The films were made on a very unstable stock, and so therefore there were fires. A great deal of the films that were made have been destroyed. Also, as well, D.W. Griffith was canonized in terms of American film history, and through a variety of processes, his work is very well preserved. We have more of D.W. Griffith's films, and we know more about his career and his work and his development and his progress than we do, I would think, really than any other single director, filmmaker for that period in the United States. He himself was extremely good at promoting himself and tooting his own horn or whatever. As it happens, the supremacy of his work and his material, not necessarily this film, because there's a lot of other film. And it's interesting because, I mean, a lot of it is really wonderful. And most of it, I can't think of almost anything that he's made that has the shortcomings that Birth of a Nation actually has. So he got a little carried away with himself, and I'm sure that Thomas Dixon had a lot to do with that. In any case, I realized suddenly while I was listening to David Blight talk what my role was actually supposed to be on this program, which is to, they kept switching the order of when we were going to be talking around, which I realize is to say something about the issue of stereotypes in the various periods taken up by this film. But there's an inherent problem in that, which always makes me very tense, which is that you're really dealing with at least 3 distinct periods of cultural production, which don't have a lot in common except the Birth of a Nation. First of all, you've got the cultural production of the Civil War period, and the degree to which African Americans are represented in that period in cultural production, and also both the way whites represent them in an unsympathetic way and the way they may or may not be trying to represent themselves. Second period is, of course, the Reconstruction period, or any period after the Civil War and the mediation of the images and the problem of the Confederate myth and the Reconstructive myth and the myth of the Civil War, that whole interim period between the Civil War and then the Jim Crow period. And third is the Jim Crow period. The film itself occurs within the Jim Crow, what I would call the Jim Crow period of production. And it bears many signs of the fact that it's meant to be a cultural intervention in what's going on during that time. It really fits within that period. So one of the things I've done in writing about it is to really talk about some of the other things that are going on with African American cultural representation at the same time that this film is occurring, that people are seeing or interacting with at the same time that they're negotiating the space around Birth of a Nation. If you could imagine a big film like Forrest Gump or some other really huge film, you would also go and hear other kinds of music and see other kinds of films. You may remember what other things you were seeing at the time. Well, that's kind of like my way of approaching the subject. And I actually have a name for this approach, which I've begun to teach within the context of. And I call it the Blues People curriculum. Actually, I am starting to, Thelonious Monk, and who was the other person? Yeah, both incoherent. Anyway, but that's okay, that's okay. That's all right, we'll keep trying. In any case, the main thing is, I actually have a little script here that I was gonna say, but what I wanted to do is just mention a couple of things that I wanted to bring into juxtaposition for you if you want to think about what else is going on and how to see it. Because as the film gets older and older, the problem of it is we know less and less about what was happening at the same time. And since, as David Blythe points out, or rather I think he was partly pointing out the fact that we're not taught this period. I was never taught this period in school. I think I had an excellent education. I wasn't taught anything that I can recall of any value about either Reconstruction or the Jim Crow period. Indeed, I don't even think I knew what the Jim Crow period was when I graduated from high school or college. But in any case, I have an article that you can refer to if you want to know more about what I have to say about the birth of the nation, because I got to promote myself. And it's called The Good Lynching and the Birth of a Nation, Discourses and Aesthetics of Jim Crow. It was in Cinema Journal in volume 43, number 1, autumn 2003. And that was my big Cinema Journal article about Birth of a Nation, in which I try to negotiate these various elements. I also have another article about a filmic text that I think is very important to consider in relationship to the Birth of a Nation, and that's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And that article is called Uncle Tom's Cabin Before and After the Jim Crow Era, and it was in TDR in spring 2000. Now, the thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin, it's got to be the single most important series of filmic texts that are important in relationship to Birth of a Nation, because, not because it was as big, it was not as big as Birth of a Nation. We don't remember it the same way. It's become somewhat obsolete. But nonetheless, the duration of Uncle Tom's Cabin was extensive, and it was widespread in its representation. As probably many of you know, maybe you don't, there were many, at least more than a dozen silent film versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin. When Birth of a Nation was made, Uncle Tom's Cabin would have been the dominant racial myth text that people knew. And one of the reasons why it was so dominant is because when Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, she did not want to, at the time that she wrote it, there wasn't any film, but there were stage performances, there were plays, or if you can call them plays, theatricals, various kinds of presentation on the stage. And she didn't want to have anything to do with that because she felt that it was beneath her and inappropriate. As a consequence, she opened a floodgate to performances of Uncle Tom's Cabin, because at that time, the nature of the copyright laws were that if you didn't want to get involved in in an interpretation of a text, then what happened is everybody stole it. It was on the stage before she had actually even published the book. And there were a floodgate of various performances. By the turn of the century, there were hundreds of so-called Tom companies that performed Uncle Tom's Cabin in a variety of formats. There were pro-Confederate Uncle Tom's Cabins, there were anti-Confederate, there were liberationists, there were emancipation. In some of the research that I've done, interestingly enough, there were both all black versions of Uncle Tom's Cabin and all white versions in blackface. As you probably know, after the Civil War, there were black blackface performers. Black performers after the Civil War were able to appropriate blackface performance, quite rightly, being themselves black, as the way Bert Williams advertised himself as a real live coon. Blackface was a dominant performance practice during the Civil War, before the Civil War, particularly in the North. And so when the Civil War ended, one of the things that black people were prepared to do first, by way of making a living and making their presence felt, was to perform music and to perform on the stage. In other words, to perform themselves. So, okay, so then you get the Tom companies, and slowly black performers are beginning to inhabit the American stage, the performance presence. Cities are being built, towns are being built, you're starting to get railroads, you start getting recorded music, records, whatever the first technology of recording music was. You get films beginning to appear, and ideas about African American images, stereotypes of African Americans are emerging and being transformed at the same time that these technologies are beginning to take over communication and representation in American culture. And the only thing they really got that they can count on people knowing is Uncle Tom's Cabin. Indeed, both Dixon, well, we can verify that Dixon was upset about Uncle Tom's Cabin being the dominant myth or legend or version of the American South and what slavery had been like. And that part of his motivation in doing first, I think, the Klansmen and Leopard Spots was to finally destroy what he thought were the incorrect legends about the relationship between the North and the South during slavery. Birth of a Nation was the consequence of his attempt to do that. So I'm directing your attention to Uncle Tom's Cabin, but Uncle Tom's Cabin is at least a 150-year story, because you've got the period in which the book was written. It's accompanied by the rise of blackface minstrelsy, then the Civil War, the little lady who started the war. Then you get the performance period afterward with blackface minstrelsy. And you know, this is all part of the buried history of American performance, right along with the burial of our knowledge of what the history of the Civil War really was and the history of race relations really were. We have also buried most of the memory of the actual mainstream performance practices that we really had. Out of shame, really. People are still ashamed of it, the blackface part. Out of these, another thing about Uncle Tom's Cabin. You know, the Uncle Tom's Cabin is just everything. First of all, as Donald Bogle said, in Toms, Coons, Mulattoes, Mammies, and Bucks, it's a hard title to remember, but, and they're in hierarchical order, actually. That's the way I remember it, is that all of the key, there really are not that many major, long-standing black stereotypes. There's only a few, and he lists them all in the title to this book. they all, except for one, come out of the Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's where they're born. The single exception is the Buck, and he's also the most controversial. Now, what Vogel says is that the Buck is born in Birth of a Nation. It's Gus. However, therein lies a debate, because it seems to me that Gus in Birth of a Nation is not a particularly strong character, as opposed to Silas Lynch, who's the mulatto lead, as opposed to Lydia, who's the mulatto female lead, as opposed to the argument that people want to make, which is Shaft or Eldridge Cleaver or whoever your favorite version is of a latter-day Buck. The point is, it's not Gus, you know. Not only that, there's a version of Uncle Tom's Cabin made in 1914 with an actual black person who, you know, because they always change the story, who shoots Simon Legree with a gun. Black person, you know, not in blackface, a real black person with a black nose, and it's a close-up, and he's got the gun, and the smoke comes out of it, and he blows on it and everything. This is 1 year before Birth of a Nation. I don't think Griffith was accidentally choosing the roles that would be in blackface versus the real black people that you can obviously see who's black. It's very interesting which roles are played by people in blackface. And when the person is in blackface, given the Jim Crow arrangement of his set and the way he filmed, they had a freedom to perform blackness in a way that would not be, it would be difficult to compel from the black actors. And I think that if you look at it that way, you can notice that. He never allows them to be involved in any really major physical contact with white actors. All of the really obnoxious and detestable black roles are played by whites in blackface. And also then, because they're in blackface, they're free to perform blackness in a way that's extremely different from the way the black performers are coming to it. Where they're coming to it from, you might, I guess I can end with this, although there's a lot of other things. I mean, I would advise you to look at other silent films during this period. Don't be disappointed by the fact that people will tell you that there's no silent films about black people, there's no silent films with black people. Don't believe any of that. Look for yourself. You will be surprised at not only the black people, but all the different kinds of people that you will see if you look at the film yourself. I also recommend that you hear the score, composer, the score that Griffith very carefully designed with the composer Briel in order to manipulate you to feel the way he wanted you to feel, and also to see the nitrate film in order to have some sense of what some of the early impact of this film is and how it has endured. I also want to say too about the score is that, I don't know if you noticed what was going on with the score and the scenes you saw. One of the things you were hearing, he had themes for each of the characters. So it's sort of a theme that goes doo 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 doo. It's got a little pipey sound to it. I can't remember it now because too much time has passed. But in any case, every time Elsie, that's Lillian Gish, appears, she's the daughter of Stoneman. And actually, if you'll notice in the beginning of the film, there's a lot of fracturing, okay, 2 minutes. There's a lot of fracturing of Austin Stoneman's home, who's actually Thaddeus Stevens. He's fictionalized. Now, the reason for that is because, I don't know if you would notice this, Elsie is with him first. I can't remember whose home that is, but there's a home in the country that's with the brothers. This is the northern family. Then there's Stoneman with his daughter, and I forget where they are, but he also lives with Lydia, who's his mistress. You see, and you're never going to see Elsie at Lydia's house, because Lydia is a whole discourse of disgrace. And in fact, all of Stoneman's friends and cronies are insulted and humiliated by the fact that they even have to deal with this woman. And so that's a whole subtext and subplot in the film. How is it that, we have to talk to her, and what is she, and she's not good enough, and she's sleazy, and then she falls down on the ground and, writhes around because of her loathsomeness. Anyhow, the piece about the music in the film is, well, actually, I have a piece of it here. Anyway, there's a book called Music and Silent Film. It's kind of an old book, and in it is the piece about the score, which actually, you can actually buy it as a recording as well. It stands up pretty well compared to the film itself, I think. It's very compelling, and I think really, really Americana in terms of music. So that would be it that I'm going to say. There's so much more to say. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Michele Matterr, and I teach media studies and film here at the New School. Is this good? There we go. And I teach with film, so I'm going to talk and show film and talk and show film. So, as a professor here at the New School, I have the honor and privilege of teaching some of the most conscious and conscientious, creative, and collectively cool students I could ever hope for. A lot of them are here today. Raise your hands, Michele students. Raise them, raise them, raise them. All right, good. Former and present. Okay. One of the courses that I teach where I use Birth of a Nation quite a bit is a class called Race, Ethnicity, and Class in Media. And we begin the course with a look at where the mass media images that we are bombarded by today that represent people of color have initiated within our hegemonic and white supremacist collective memory. And so it is with this imperative that I begin the course with at least a sampling of imagery from Birth of a Nation. I don't make people sit through the whole thing. That is a bit much to ask for, but I do show them a sampling of Birth of a Nation, much to my students' chagrin, probably more than they want to see. And then on top of it, to make matters worse, I also make them do a group project where they have to give us their responses and impressions of the topics that we've discussed in class. I get a lot of pushback on this, and by the end of the class, people always say, I'm really glad you made us do these group projects, Michele. And the purpose of the group projects is that sometimes students have very emotional, visceral responses to films like Birth of a Nation, to films like Classified X by Melvin Van Peebles, and Ethnic Notions by Marlon Riggs. And so in order to get out their emotions and to respond to what they feel as a result of these films, they do these amazing final projects at the end of the class. And what I'm going to show you today is a sampling of two of those pieces, because I think their responses are, in fact, responses to having seen Birth of a Nation, even those clips, those little clips that I show. They have become a visual analysis of this hysterical, not historical, accounting of the period of Reconstruction following slavery. So the first clip we're going to see is a 1.5-minute introduction from a 30-minute piece that one of my class groups did from fall 2007. And this introduction is an opening montage that I think sort of frames everything I want to say. So Dan, can we have the first clip?
media has come a long way, at least technologically. Yet, a couple of hours in front of the TV or at the movies reveals a disturbing trend.
That chronic make me paranoid, baby.
Today's contemporary media does not operate with a sense of history. Resistance to white heterosexual male domination comes from immigration hysteria, Asia emerging as a financial force, Black leaders continuing to voice their concerns about the systematic inequalities their communities face, and a perceived cultural war between the Middle East and Western philosophies.
Leave this place or die.
In the face of this, modern media is either knowingly or unknowingly reproducing and broadcasting stereotypical images.
Damn straight.
By placing contemporary images side by side with their historical forebears, it becomes apparent that the media is still playing upon the same stereotypes, reinforcing white hegemonic domination in a time where it faces resistance from African Americans, Hispanics, Asians, and Arabs.
Oh, what a day. What a motherfucking day.
And if we all recall, that last clip with Denzel Washington is what he won the Oscar for. So as a group class project, that's pretty impressive, right? I mean, I think this piece goes on. It's a 30-minute long presentation altogether. Michael Falco, Terrell Frazier, Anna Santiago, and Evan Nades. That it goes into each group is detailed in imagery. It starts off with African American segment, which is subtitled Violet Bucks, Coons, and Mammies. The Mexican American segment is subtitled Banditos, Greasers, and Good-Hearted Simpletons. The Asian American segment is subtitled Model Minorities, Ninja Masters, and China Dolls. And lastly, the Arab American segment is subtitled Sheiks, Terrorists, and Religious Fanatics. So, I think they did an amazing job, really, on this piece. And needless to say, after that presentation, I had no doubt that something had sunken in throughout the 15 weeks of class discussions and readings and screenings, and that, in fact, Evan turned this piece of film, just this introduction, from that, it turned into a whole panel that we did with the Center on Communication, and then that panel was then broadcast on WNYC TV under the title Real Images, REEL, Stereotypes in Media. So as you can see, that had, from that one little clip, Birth of a Nation had a pretty big impact. Another class I teach is a history of cinema class entitled Movements in World Cinema, Part 1. And it's Part 1 because of the vast content involved in this course. I teach Part 1, which is the time frame that covers from the silent era up to the 1950s, and sometimes if I can stretch it into the 60s. And then Part 2 is taught by other professors who do more contemporary issues and film movements. And I probably don't teach this course quite as traditionally as others might, because some of the topics that we cover include things like early cinema and its alternatives, where we talk about Oscar Micheaux, which is one of the other filmmakers that you should definitely look for film by, African-American, first independent African-American filmmaker. The emergence of Mexican cinema, Hollywood in transition, and imperialism at home and abroad, which touches on, among other things, Anglophone and Francophone African cinema. Then we also, of course, have a Black presence in cinema as it relates to the same chronological time frame. And of course, it's during this time frame that we must go back to Birth of a Nation. And the difference between this class and the other class I teach is in a way that really discusses the various movements, the global movements within the creation of cinema from the aspect of the socioeconomic and moral issues that were occurring during those historical eras when the films were created. So it's really, a lot of times it's in direct response to and resistance to those issues of the time. And it's during one of the primary instances of resistance to Birth of a Nation, which Michele touched on a little bit, but it's rarely discussed from our point of view as what the African American communities were doing in response to Birth of a Nation in 1915 when it was released. Thank you. And there was a huge form of protest, David mentioned, huge outpouring from the NAACP, from other groups that were very politically involved during the time, and from the communities themselves. And we don't hear a lot about those protests, but they really did have an impact. And Ed Guerrero talks about this in his book, Framing Blackness, the African American Image in Film. Ed teaches at NYU. I use his text all the time in my classes. And he talks about how, rarely when there was this huge outpouring of attention given to a film, in fact, the film showed in Atlanta, the film opened on Thanksgiving night in 1915. And 25,000 Klansmen were marching down Peachtree Avenue in celebration of the opening of this film. So as you can imagine, there was some serious backlash as a response to this film opening. And as Ed says, again, this is something to remember, is that this is the first time a film is shown in the White House, any film, ever. First time. And Woodrow Wilson, like David talked about, was the sitting president and endorsed the film. So, as Ed says, of course, quote, considering racism, discrimination, and brutality at large in that historical moment, African Americans had every reason to fear that what was depicted on the screen could easily be acted out against them in reality. He then goes on to describe some actual tangible evidence where the positive impact of these protests had, finally, because we witnessed, upon the release of that film, we witnessed some of the footage that was actually cut out of the film, 558 feet, in response to the protests that came out of the African American community. So just to give you a little background of the scenes that were cut, the first set of scenes were several scenes that depicted black soldiers attacking white women. A letter from President Lincoln saying that he really did not believe in the equality of the races. Now, remember that point for later on. And the third scene, which proposed the deportation of blacks back to Africa as a solution to America's race problem. So imagine the additional incredible amount of damage that could have been inflicted had these additional psychotic truths remained part of this treatise, which continues to project itself, as Ed says, into the continuum of cinema history. And it is with these ideas in mind that my Movements in Cinema class from fall 2005, some of whom I know are here, Earl Harris, wave Earl, Tawana Pettis, and Essence Manigault, they chose to reframe some of the images from Birth of a Nation as stills, which really, you'll see, really has even more of an impact as a still image. And they chose to set them to the contemporary soundtrack of Gil Scott-Heron's Winter in America. And you need to listen to the lyrics closely. Dan, can we run my second clip, please?
From the Indians who welcome the pilgrims, and to the buffaloes who once ruled the plain. Like the vultures circling beneath the dark clouds, looking for the rain, looking for the rain. Just like the cities that stagger on the coastline, and a nation that just can't stand much more. Like the forest buried beneath the highway, never had a chance to grow. Never had a chance to grow. And now it's winter. It's winter in America. Yes, and all of the healers have sent away. Yeah, but the people know it's winter. Winter in America. And ain't nobody fighting, 'cause nobody knows what to say. Save your soul, Lord knows, from winter in America. The Constitution, a noble piece of paper, with free society, the struggle but they died in vain. And now democracy is a ragtime on the corner, hoping for some rain. They look like either hoping for some rain. And I see the robins perched in barren treetops. They're watching last-ditch races marching across the floor. But just like the peace signs that vanished in our dreams, never had a chance to grow. Never had a chance to grow. And now it's winter. It's winter in America. And all of the healers.
So what I always like to say around pieces like this is, just imagine, this film was made at the beginning of the moving image. You know, the first time we're seeing, on a big screen, we're seeing a moving image that's not a play, that's not a performance. And if this is your first encounter with anyone of color, and it's up here on this big screen, and it's moving like it's actually real, just imagine the impact that that's having on you as a white person. That's all I want to say. Okay. But I just want to talk a little bit about the ingenious structure that this piece had, this group had. This was winter, and winter, as you saw from the title card, represented the subjugation of black people. Then it goes on to represent spring, representing self-denigration, which was perpetuated. And it's a chronological thing. Like each season is chronologically moving us along the continuum of imagery of blacks during this same time period. So then spring moves us into the Gone with the Wind era and other films that came out of the Hollywood canon. Then summer represents some empathy, finally, coming into play, in films such as Pinky and Imitation of Life. And then finally, autumn is represented as celebration, because then we get some of the non-threatening images like Sidney Poitier and Dorothy Dandridge that make their appearance in Hollywood productions during the 50s and 60s. Needless to say, the impact of Birth of a Nation played a large role on this group's presentation, as their visual analysis so aptly depicts. Now, just before the last clip I want to show you, I want to just diverge a moment to talk about the fact that American cinema is not the only place where these influences were felt. I want to mention the Dutch author and scholar, and before I mess up his name, somebody who speaks Dutch can correct me afterwards, Jan Nederveen Piertusse, who is the author of White on Black, Images of Africa and Blacks in Western Popular Culture. It's a book that I use quite a bit as well in my classes. He cites Birth of a Nation as, quote, the notorious Ku Klux Klan-inspired film. The nadir, dominated entirely by the enemy image of the black brute, drawing on the motif of Beauty and the Beast, along with the theme of rape. He continues that in European countries, the film industry followed the pattern of colonial propaganda by reproducing stereotypes and mocking marginal social groups. This new medium ingratiated itself with mainstream audiences and established its reputation. So not only is it having this impact here, it's having the same impact outside of these borders. What proof do we have that this phenomenon still exists? Well, just ask any international student here at the New School. Ask them where they got their images, their first images of people of color, black and brown people, prior to their coming to the States. Most likely, all their references have come from MTV, BET, and B-rated Hollywood movies and television projects past, and maybe some not totally current, but some current. The undoing of these images in the minds of international students is a regular occurrence in the classes that I teach. So to conclude my segment, and I will conclude with this video, this next piece I think is really the pièce de résistance, and that's a literal pièce de résistance. And it's from Kevin Wilmot's film called The CSA. People know that film? All right, David knows that film, which stands for the Confederated States of America. And this is a really ingenious film. It's a parody on how the world would look today had the South won the Civil War. Unfortunately, but unfortunately also to be expected, this film had a very brief theatrical release back in 2004. But it's really a terrible thing that it didn't get more widely seen because it is creative, it's insightful, it's very substantive, it challenges the psyche of what we're talking about today while being entertaining and informative. And it's really a testament to the impact of Birth of a Nation on this filmmaker who was an amazing talent I think he's from the East Coast originally, but he's teaching out at the University of Kansas now. That's Kevin Wilmot. I don't want to say too much about the clip, but just as a means of introduction, I think Kevin must have known about that scene that was cut out of Lincoln saying that he didn't believe in the equality of the races. I think Kevin must have known about that scene. Because let's just say payback is a... Run the clip, please. Thank you.
And in a matter of months, Southern troops took the nation's capital, capturing the White House.
Some volume, please.
But there was no sign of President Lincoln. Confederate forces were everywhere. A desperate Lincoln turned to Harriet Tubman. Tubman, wanted with a huge bounty on her head, would be the last resort for a president literally running for his life. Tubman's Underground Railroad was a series of way stations that organized the escape of over 200 slaves out of the United States to freedom. But her dearest passenger would require Tubman's most ingenious plan to date.
She chose to disguise President Lincoln in blackface and travel with him along one of her many secret slave routes. When Lincoln scoffed at the plan, Tubman, never one to mince words, reminded him of the huge bounty on his head. She said simply, "We're both niggas now, Mr. President."
In 1915, the capture of Lincoln was also dramatized in D.W. Griffiths' silent film classic, The Hunt for Dishonest Abe. Trial was convened, and former President Lincoln was convicted of war crimes against the Southern nation. He was imprisoned in Fortress Monroe near Norfolk, Virginia. It was from the window of his damp cell that he watched the execution of the woman who runaway slaves called Moses.
Thank you.